I think we need to use that leadership at this incredibly difficult time during the war, where, as you rightly say, Putin has put his... He doesn't care how many people he murders. He doesn't care how many people go through the meat grinder of a front line. He will just carry on sending them because he's not accountable in any kind of recognizable democratic way. And we've got to help our Ukrainian friends defend themselves. And that is why I think us both sending them another $500 million on top of our already record size thing, all this extra kit, and then saying to the rest of NATO, we're going to increase our budget now to 2.5% of GDP, which is what we want to set as the new NATO minimum spend. And that's what we're going to be saying to NATO come the 75th anniversary. I think in that way we can lead again and make sure that Ukraine gets what it needs to win this war.
And Grant, you and I obviously follow events in Ukraine really closely, but to someone who isn't following it that closely, I mean, it sounds like an awful lot of money, and now it sounds like more money on top of an awful lot of money. What can you actually point to? You know, how has British aid made a difference on the battlefield?
It matters here, and it matters here because if Putin were to win that war, he wouldn't stop in Ukraine. He'd carry on. He's talked about other areas that he thinks should be part of Greater Russia, basically the old Soviet Union. That would affect us. Other autocratic leaders around the world would look at this and go, well, the West can be beaten. You just have to carry on for a couple of years and we all give in. So what does that mean in Taiwan, for example, and the chips that are made there and the way that affects our economy? So the connection back to anyone watching this is direct.
This $3 billion, I understand that it's going to continue. How long will that pledge continue?
Yeah, so that was the other thing we announced last week. And I'm really pleased you mentioned actually, because it was almost lost in the flurry of we're going to spend 2.5% of our GDP on defence and what have you. But we also said we will now match the $3 billion we spent every single year, at least to the end of the decade. I mean, I'm not making a prediction about the length of the war because who knows, but that's another 5, 6 years, and we'll do $3 billion a year every single year. And I wanted to do that because when I speak to President Zelensky, it is really important that he knows that we're in this for the long term. And this isn't just, otherwise they're living hand to mouth with this. We want them to know that Britain is there. And he will say, as Zelensky has said to me, without Britain, they just don't know where they would have been without our leadership.
But Britain has said, and you've said, as long as it takes. Britain stands with Ukraine as long as it takes. But you must have some sense, how long it might take. Is this a forever war?
Well, look, it's not right now. It was frozen on the front line, as you rightly say. Russia has been moving west, not particularly fast, but they've been making gains. That's absolutely sure. It took far too long to get the money through Congress, and frankly, everybody needs to step up. I don't think even if you're a European nation now, but you're not a member of NATO, maybe it's time to think about it, right? Because, as actually has recently happened with Sweden and Finland joining, you can't really be neutral in a world in which an autocrat is prepared to just go and seize neighbours' land. How can you stay neutral in that situation? And I think everybody needs to be contributing. Everybody needs to be getting on board on this continent, let alone America. I mean, they don't live on this continent. It's great they come and help. But it's also our responsibility, which is why, as I say, 2.5%.
Is there anyone you'd single out? Anyone you think needs to be doing more?
Well, anyone who's not currently, frankly, a member of NATO, but enjoys NATO's protection. I think it is time for people to think about, given a tyrant, once again, we've seen this before in history, moving west, I think it's time to kind of stop and review.
And just quickly on that, I know Iona wants to come in, but there is a risk that with elections in America, there could be a change of administration, and it's uncertain, were Donald Trump to become president, how he would or whether he would support Ukraine. Indeed, he said he could end the war in a day, and that his plan is to effectively make Kyiv capitulate. In that scenario, are you confident that the rest of NATO, or rather the rest of the Ukraine alliance, the contact group, can continue to support Ukraine without America?
I mean, first of all, I was talking to the NATO Secretary General last week, Stoltenberg, about this in Poland, and he rightly points out, I agree, that actually, he's dealt with, and we all have, actually, a Trump presidency before, and, NATO still goes and all the rest of it. But actually, more to the point, in that very delicate vote in Congress, it really hinged on the Speaker, Mike Johnson, supporting the vote going through. And then the more, what you call radical, I suppose, Republicans not going after Speaker Johnson as a result of him doing that. And Trump was very interesting in this. He specifically went out of his way to support Mike Johnson, the Republican Speaker. Now, he could have gone the opposite way, and I think it's conceivable if he had done, that the package may have had trouble passing. Trump didn't do that. So I always sort of think with these things, judge people on their actions rather than their words, and I think that's really true of Trump.
You think Trump's changed his mind on you?
I don't know whether it's changed his mind, but look, as I said before, if you think about America's interests, even if you took the view that some of the most, call them extreme commentators in America might, or politicians of, oh, Europe doesn't matter, we're not worried. Even if you took that view, and I don't think many people think that, but even if you did, if you're America, you still care about what happens in China and Taiwan and chip manufacturing and all these other things. And as I said before, the single message you'd send to autocrats everywhere if the West said you can't just walk into your neighbour and take it over as Putin's done with Ukraine, and then we go, well, actually, we're sort of a bit of an attention deficit over a couple of years and we're sort of bored of it, so you can now. If you did that, then America's own power would be directly hit by that, and Trump would recognise that as much as the next person. I think he does.
I think bringing back US policies to Ukraine's front line, I'd love to ask, the Americans have signalled they're uncomfortable with long-range strikes actually into Russian territory. But last week, Britain's Chief of Defence, Admiral Tony Radakin, said that Britain supports these attacks. Would you be able to sort of clarify the UK's position on this?
Well, look, first of all, I'm obviously not going to get into sort of tactics and those sort of things, other than to say two things. First, we've always been quite forward-leaning on all of this, and you've seen how, given that Putin walked into Crimea and just took it in 2014 and there was no military fight back, you've seen how our brave Ukrainian friends have been opening up the Black Sea. In fact, the Russian Black Sea fleet no longer sails in the Black Sea, and certainly doesn't sail at its own liberty in the Black Sea, because Ukrainians who don't have a navy have managed to make it inoperable for Putin's navy. So Britain has always been supportive of the whole of Ukraine being, back under Ukrainian control. Secondly, in terms of Ukraine's own tactics and how they prosecute the war, we can't realistically have a position where everyone accepts Ukrainian critical national infrastructure like power stations and what have you being blasted to bits, and they go, but Ukraine, you can't attack the infrastructure of the country who are attacking you. We won't let you do. I mean, that would be ridiculous. But it is a decision. Those things are a decision for Ukraine. We are not direct combatives in this war, and we will never be, because this is not a NATO country, Ukraine. So they don't come under Article 5 protection, and that will have to be a question for Ukraine themselves.
I'd like to ask about Russia's reach into NATO countries, and I want to ask you specifically about GPS jamming. Now, you remember I was lucky or perhaps unlucky enough to be on your Royal Air Force jet.
Our famous trip together.
Yeah, when we were flying back, and that aircraft was jammed in eastern Poland. We've since at The Sun done an investigation which reveals the extent of this. I mean, thousands of civilian flights are getting jammed almost on a daily basis, and just last week there were 2 Finnair aircraft that turned back on their way to Estonia because of the jamming affecting their navigation systems. That has prompted leaders in the Baltic states to warn of a looming air disaster. I mean, how serious is this, and what's being done? Yeah,
well, look, on one level, completely irresponsible to be jamming those GPS signals. And, we were flying, via south of Kaliningrad, I think. And we experienced jams for about, 20, 25 minutes. Then actually, I'm a pilot myself, and I was chatting to the pilots about it. There was by the way, absolutely no drama about it at all. As a pilot, there are many other ways that you can navigate an aircraft, and including talking to air traffic control, but also time-based navigation systems, which are not GPS. So it's usually perfectly safe to fly, but in congested skies, GPS is an important part of that. And I think we are seeing a world in which GPS, both jamming and spoofing, so aircraft being shown where they're not and that sort of thing, has become increasingly critical. First of all, utterly condemn people doing that. Again, Putin just knows basically no end to his own evil, is my view. But as the British military in particular, we're developing systems which use things like precise navigational time, PNT, in order to use systems which don't require GPS satellites from space to tell you where you are.
And do you think it's feasible that civilian aircraft might need to adopt
Yes,
that?
and they already do to an extent. So even on the aircraft we were on, actually they have systems on there which were able to tell us where we were based on what time did you take off and what altitude you were at and all those types of things. Those systems are becoming more and more precise all the time. And I can confirm actually that defence research and development is at the cutting edge of doing even more with this. And I imagine that in years to come, probably all aircraft will have many alternative versions of navigation for exactly this reason. But how irresponsible to block GPS knowing that you're blocking civilian airlines.